Welcome everybody to today's program. We're so glad to have you here, especially Mr. Malhotra and Dr. Clooney. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really happy to have you. So today's presentation, of course, is a book presentation by Mr. Rajiv Malhotra with commentary by Dr. Francis Clooney from Harvard University. And this book presentation is about being different, an Indian challenge to Western universalism. So I'm sure you're all very excited to hear about that today. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce Mr. Rajiv Malhotra. He is the founder and president of the Infinity Foundation, which is a leading organization in the Indian community dedicated to providing an indigenous Indic perspective on many issues affecting the Indian American community today, affecting the study of India in academia and the way Indians are perceived elsewhere as well. He is a telecommunications entrepreneur and has since broadened to bring the Indic perspective to a variety of different fields. Currently, he's also chairman of the Board of Governors at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth Center for Indic Studies, so we're very proud to welcome him here for that as well. He's also been appointed to the Asian American Committee for the state of New Jersey in chairing a series of Asian education programs in schools. He's authored Being Different most recently, but also Breaking India, another seminal work in the field, as well as provided the inspiration for Invading the Sacred, a book about Hindu religious perspectives in academia. So he's a very prominent, very provocative, very controversial, and very insightful author that we are so delighted to have with us at the Center for Indic Studies today. Mr. Malhotra, we welcome you.
Thank you for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be here. And thanks to Francis Clooney for being here to give us comments. The cover of the book is a motif of a certain narrative in Hindu philosophy, the narrative called Samudra Manthan, which is churning the ocean for creative output. And there are two opposing groups churning the ocean. The front image shows one side, and the back image shows the other side, and the spindle is in the spine of the book. Now, this churning of the ocean of opposites is a sort of process I've carried out in producing this book. I've tried to discuss, debate, have conversations with numerous people from other points of view, including Catholic theologians. Francis was kind enough to give a comment on the, detailed his analysis of the whole manuscript a year ago. I sent it to Protestant theologians, Buddhists, different denominations of Hindu scholars, Western secularists, scientists, and so on, philosophers, in order to get back critical views so that I could respond, and in responding, improve the arguments in the book. So that motif is the process I've carried out. I realized that some of the ideas of what is India, what is Dharma, what is West, even what is Christianity, are not so simple terms because they are very complex. They include many views, many streams, many ideologies within them. I realize that, and I address that in the book. But still, these terms are reference points, because if you were to search any single day's news and you were to search for West, you'll see thousands of hits. People are talking about the West, whether it's Western economy, whether it's Western military, whether it's Western powers, whether it's Western thought. And you look in the catalog of a college or a university, you'll find a lot of things in the humanities about Western stuff. So the entity exists, even though it is not a simplified entity. It's a complex entity, but it exists. The premise of this book is that difference is a necessary built-in feature of the cosmos. There's differences in plants and animals and human cultures. I mean, if you look at trees, there's oak trees, one part of it, one kind of tree, and a certain kind of category within the oak would be a particular kind of oak tree, and then not every oak tree is the same as another one, and not even two leaves of the same oak tree are identical. So the differences exist in many, many levels. And the same is true of animals, it's true of cultures and geographies. So it's quite natural that civilizations have differences, and these differences are inherent. And there is nothing superior or inferior necessarily about these differences, but like an apple is different from an orange, civilizations have difference. Unfortunately, it's become a fashion to want the sameness. And a lot of resistance to this book from people who say, well, why do you want to be different? Why don't you say that we are all the same? This sameness, the desire for sameness, kind of is at the expense of what difference is to be appreciated. And I call this difference anxiety, which means the anxiety that I'm different from others. It could be difference in gender, could be difference in race, ethnicity, could be in religion, could be in whatever. So the anxiety that I'm different from others is a starting point of this book. I analyze that, and I categorize it as anxiety over difference from a superiority point of view, which says I'm kind of superior and you're not like me, and that has led historically to a lot of problems. It can also be a difference anxiety from an inferiority point of view, which says I'm inferior to you, and every time we talk about difference, I feel kind of bad about it. There's a complex, inferiority complex. So the alternative to difference anxiety is mutual respect for difference. So difference is there, but we are mutually respecting. So I'm who I am, and I'm distinct, and I want to preserve that because that's my sense of being and my sense of identity. And at the same time, I want to respect you for being different and want you to do the same. So difference with mutual respect, even difference as a celebration. That's the overall point that I'm trying to make in this book of talking about difference. So the problem has the problem that has come about, particularly in the case of Indian civilizations and Dharma civilizations, is colonization has given the West a sort of de facto status of universalism. Western language has become universal, and in the words are many meanings that are implied. The Western calendar is universal. The system of measuring time has become universal. The Western philosophy, Western sense of history, Western law. So the universalizing of the West has happened not because it happens to be a universal truth, but because of power. And Chinese have started questioning that. They've come up with the Confucian ethic as a counter to the Protestant ethic. And there's a Professor Tu Wemming at Harvard who writes a lot about it. And the Chinese government has started 100 Confucian institutes in different parts of the world to teach a Chinese alternative to Chinese worldview of things in every respect. So certainly a Confucian universalism, you might say, that is being propagated is definitely a counterexample to the Western universalism. And one might argue that Islam has a claim to universalism also, according to which the whole world, the way things are done, the way society is organized, and the family law and all kinds of things, they have an alternative view. It's not a question of what you like or dislike, it's just a question of acknowledging that this is the state of the world, these are civilizational alternatives that exist. So I've been churning on the question, is there a dharmic alternative as well? This started many years ago, more than a decade ago, when I was invited to give a talk on, Huntington had just come out with his book, The Clash of Civilizations. So I was asked to comment on, where is India in the clash of civilizations? And my view was that there is an Indian point of view, but it's not a point of view that wants to necessarily impose. It is a different point of view in the sense that it is not an expansionist point of view. It is a point of view that has this difference with mutual respect built into it. And a good example is the way Sanskriti, the word Sanskriti is sort of like civilization or culture, and it's not the same thing as Sanskrit, which is a language. Sanskriti, the culture and civilization that emanated from India, spread across Asia with no army, with no kind of pressure to convert, at a time when the Chinese welcomed it, The Chinese sent their brightest students to universities in India to learn Sanskriti, bring it back. Buddhists took not only religion, but art and medicine and agriculture and science and astronomy, all kinds of things with them. All over these Southeast Asian countries, you'll find a huge amount of Sanskriti in their archaeology, in their language, in their sense of who they are. So it became this export of India became quite a pan-Asian civilization, with no military, no one imposing a governor, no one wanting to collect taxes. It was not done like the spread of Christianity or the spread of Islam historically. And there was no attempt to change their sense of history and language and put an Indian language on top of them and give them a new sense of who they are. So that attempt was never made. So there is an alternative role model for universalism, for globalization. This reminds me, a few years ago, I was chairing an Asian Studies Commission in New Jersey, and we were having a discussion on how to bring Asia into the curriculum. So one of the topics which they address in high school, one of the standards is to talk about spread of civilization. So I said, why don't we also include the spread of, Indian civilization and Asian civilization? And at first they all said, yeah, that's very nice, of course we should, and so the minutes showed that, yeah, we're going to do that. It was sort of just to placate or just to be politically correct. I guess they accepted it. But then when it was time for action, a lot of people started wondering, what does that really mean? I mean, they started, when the committees did some further research, they came back and said, we don't know of any examples. And they were looking for expansionist conquests. So I was asked once, who conquered Asia from India? Who conquered? Can you give examples? So it became quite a debate to explain that the spread of civilization without conquest is actually possible and an alternative model. So you don't look for armies as correlates to your claim that the civilization has spread, because it was taken in trickles. It was sort of very pulled in by the receiving side and not pushed out by the donor side. So I'm just giving that as an example of a new kind of worldview, a new kind of universalism which does not suffer from the inherent clash, because I'm also asked, aren't you creating conflict by showing difference, by emphasizing difference? And my response is that while certain kinds of difference have conflicts built in them because of the exclusivity claim, because of the claim that it's my way and this an edict from God or whatever the rationale might be, that need not be the case. And if there is a pluralism of worldviews, a pluralism of faiths that is built into a tradition, an open architecture as I call it in this book, then the problem of conflict is not inherent in the nature of difference. So the first point I have is that there is difference in the cosmos that's built in. The second point is civilizations are a particular case of this. Civilizations do have difference. There is no reason to deny that difference. The third point is that Western universalism is an issue because there are other claims of universalism also that need a seat at the table. Now, in this book, I introduce several terms and describe them in detail. I introduce a new vocabulary to deal with this issue of difference. One of the terms I introduce is called digestion. And by digestion, I mean one civilization getting digested into another. So the integrity of a civilization is lost when different parts of it are mapped onto Western equivalents, or what are considered to be Western equivalents. So yoga becomes Christian yoga, Vipassana becomes mindfulness meditation, and the origin of Vipassana and its Buddhist philosophy is left behind. It becomes a good healing exercise, healing methodology, but its application to go beyond just healing and relaxation to higher states of consciousness are not necessarily conveyed, because if you were to bring along the whole Vipassana philosophy, that would be a richer way of doing it. So under this metaphor of digestion, I discuss how the translation of Sanskrit words into English can be a form of digestion because the original Sanskrit idea is lost. For example, I have chapter 5 talks about non-translatables, words that are not translatable, and I give you 15 or 20 examples why Shakti cannot be translated as energy, because it's more than just say electricity or light or something. It's a whole different philosophy built into the notion of Shakti, and why it cannot be translated as Holy Spirit also, which some people have. Why Atman cannot be translated as soul, which gurus are doing, just to make it easy for them to explain and win over Western converts. They are trying to reduce the difference and make it same, so that it looks like it's easier to bring in a large number of Western followers. But these Western followers are not as secure, as permanent, as long-term, as deeply committed as they would be if they were required to actually study what the Indian concept really means, rather than a quick substitution with a Western concept. Soul is not the same as Atman because classically souls don't reincarnate. Of course, there's a view that they do, but the mainstream view is that soul doesn't reincarnate, and certainly soul is not in animals or plants, but Atman is. So when you replace Atman with soul, you've also tampered with its richer meaning and replaced it with a simpler meaning. I also explained that Dharma is not religion. Dharma cannot be easily replaced with the word religion. It creates a lot of problems. Nor is it law. Sometimes people translate it as law, sometimes they translate it as ethics or morality. It's a little bit of all of these, but it's actually quite a distinct and profound notion by itself. So to prevent this translation as a distortion and as a form of digestion, I recommend introducing certain Sanskrit words into the English language. Make the English language richer by introducing the original Sanskrit word, make it part of the English language. For instance, the word yoga is part of the English language, and luckily it survived as the original word because Max Miller, who translated the great works of India, many volumes, luckily he did not translate Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Had he translated Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, he might have turned yoga into exercise or gymnastics or prayer or something like that, and today people wouldn't be thinking of it as something distinct. So the distinctiveness of a tradition is partly preserved in its non-translatables. There is Arabic non-translatables, there's every language, Latin and so on. So I'm not making the case for Sanskrit per se, but I'm giving Sanskrit as my example of non-translatables. The issue of digestion is also a matter of philosophical mapping. So it's not just words, but philosophy. If you map the idea of the journey of the self to a Judeo-Christian framework, then you tend to ignore either explicitly or implicitly the idea of reincarnation and replace it with one life, after that eternal heaven or hell. And you've really done away with the huge corpus of knowledge in the Indian spiritual traditions. All the Dharma traditions, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, Sikh, they have this built-in idea of karma and reincarnation. So in this book, I have a conversation or a point of encounter between the karma reincarnation worldview on one side and the original sin, which requires virgin birth and God to take incarnation as Jesus and then sacrifice and for redemption and so on. And I show that if you assume either side as your starting point, it negates the other side. So there is an incompatibility. You cannot uphold the ideas that are sacrosanct to a lot of mainstream Christians. Not all, I agree, but a lot of mainstream Christians, known as the Nicene Creed, and recited very frequently. And in fact, on the websites of many denominations, I went and did research, the definition of their faith, their particular denomination, involves the Nicene Creed as an article of belief. So if you take the principal tenets of Nicene Creed as your starting points, then it's very difficult to accommodate karma and reincarnation, and vice versa. So I try to highlight in this book what is not possible to translate, what is in the philosophy and metaphysics that's not possible to map, because if you map either one onto the other, you do violence one way or violence the other way. So this is a much more challenging, the interfaith discourse that I am calling for is far more challenging than has been the case. I'm saying that the interfaith, the reason the interfaith has failed to produce results beyond just nice political statements of how we're all the same and we love each other and so on, the reason is that people have not felt comfortable addressing differences and have not wanted to just negotiate or discuss or reason how to coexist in mutual harmony despite those differences and still have mutual respect. So the kind of denial mode about differences I see as a serious problem. And so one of the recent discussions I had in India, I just came back, by the way, and had 15 events in a month or less than a month in different places in India, and I'm putting up these on YouTube, so if I get people's email addresses, I'll send you the links. And they are academic, they are corporate groups, and they are religious groups, and there are eminent thinkers that I've interviewed one-on-one. There's one individual who is a very famous Christian that has lived, is an Anglican church person who's lived in India most of his life, loves India, champions Indian culture, speaks on its behalf, famous BBC correspondent. And we have a 1.5 hour conversation in which he starts by saying, I'm not happy that you're talking so much about difference in this book. I wish we talk about how we are the same. So I said, okay, you can be same as me. Or would you like me to be same as you? There's a difference. So we go through these issues of difference. And one of the things I raise is the historicity of Jesus and the exclusivity of Jesus. It tampers and steps on the toes of the Hindu claim that there have been many incarnations. So if we are the same on the Christian terms, then it means we have to distort some ideas about our own tradition. On the other hand, when I asked him, would you be willing to accept if he said Jesus is a great incarnation, one of the greatest, but there's others? And he has a hard time. He has a hard time because he says, well, the church, my church won't accept it. So then we move on to the next one where we talk about the nature of the self in Hinduism is called Satchitanand, which means divinity. You are divinity. And he has a hard time with that. So he has a hard time because he can say, well, there is the divinity in me, and the divinity can come in me, but it is not that my innate nature is divine. That could be a problem. Then we talk about whether he would accept the idea of Shakti as immanence, because he says we also have the idea of immanence. The divine is immanent. And whereas in Hinduism we have the idea of Shakti as sort of the all-pervading, and it's tempting to say that they mean the same thing. So then I asked him, well, if they mean the same thing, then our deities, the images, the forms that we worship, the murtis as we call them, would you be willing to put them in the church? Would you be willing to take all the Hindu deities and put them in the church? Because if it's all divine presence, he felt that it's all Holy Spirit. If it's all Holy Spirit, then let's take it to the stage and ask and see if a church would put them all in the church and worship them. And he says, no, that will never be accepted. So I said, well, why won't it be accepted? You just said that Holy Spirit is also all pervasive. So if it's all pervasive, then these are forms of divine. And therefore you should be able to take me to any church and show me that they have no problem with them. So he says, well, then that borders on polytheism. That will border on polytheism, and it will border on idolatry. So you see, the point is, it's a very interesting 1.5 hour debate I have with this gentleman. A very open, very candid, extremely fair, extremely kind, nice person, very Hindu-friendly kind of person. And despite a strong and genuine desire to sort of not talk differences and talk about how things are the same. When we talk about specific articles, it becomes very difficult for him to accept those beyond just a sort of a very surface sameness. So I've been doing this, and I intend to use this book as a sort of starting point for many conversations, to convince people that we need a different kind of interfaith where the dialogue is not based on, well, aren't we all believing in one truth and one God, and we all love each other, and we should avoid bad things and help our neighbor, and so therefore we are all same because we have certain similarities of ideas. But rather elevate the interfaith dialogue to a dialogue of differences with mutual respect. Because once you've internalized the principle that there are going to be differences, and these differences should not be turned into tension or anxiety, then people can be more relaxed. And I show in this book the idea of integral unity that is very sort of common to most dharmic worldviews, as opposed to what I call synthetic unity in the West. That this idea of integral unity lends itself to pluralism built in. So it can assimilate many, many different ideas. But the difficulty I have in discussing with people from the Abrahamic traditions is that the converse is not so easily accepted. From their side, the idea that the dharmic claim is legitimate, not tolerant, but legitimate, actually legitimate, is not so easy to accept, because it violates, at least in the mainstream institutional stand, it violates an article of exclusivity which is built into their tradition. So the book has 4 chapters on 4 different kinds of differences. That's the whole book. I've just given you the overall purpose of the book and the project of the book, but I haven't gotten into specific examples of differences. There's 4 very big categories of difference that you should take a look at in the book. Probably the most significant is what I term history centrism. I use that term history centrism to describe a view in the Abrahamic traditions, which is that the study of history is absolutely necessary in order for them to know the highest truth. And in the Indian traditions, history is nice, and in certain denominations in Vaishnavism, it is also given a huge amount of emphasis. But overall, when you look at the Dharma overall, the idea that the human being is Satchitanand, and therefore through yoga, through meditation, through various spiritual practices, one can achieve a higher states of consciousness, and one can have unity consciousness, one can actually experience what the prophets experienced or what the rishis experienced, one can actually get the first-hand, direct, first-person experience of the ultimate. That makes history less relevant, because history is just an anecdote of somebody else having that experience, which I'm also capable of having, and each of you is capable of having. So this ahistorical, what I call embodied knowing, or in Sanskrit Adhyatma Vidya, is a kind of an antithesis or antidote to history centrism, which says that man is infinitely removed from God, has no access to the Jesus experience or the Muhammad experience, and therefore must rely on their historical accounts for him to know the truth. So this I refer to as history centrism. And then I explain that history centrism has the issue with it that history centrism tends to lock you into non-negotiables. You cannot negotiate the historical elements, because if you were to, it would compromise your whole system. And the example I give is Jesus in Islam is not seen the same way as Jesus in Christianity. Jesus in Islam is a great prophet. He is one of the greatest prophets, but he's not Son of God. And there's a reason for it. Because if Jesus was seen as Son of God, Muhammad is not Son of God. He's not considered Son of God by Islam. He's a regular human being like anyone else who is just transmitting God's message. So he's a messenger, like the person who's a spokesman. So the teachings of Son of God, being God's own incarnation, cannot be superseded by statements coming out of a regular prophet. And to supersede, because prophet is more recent than Jesus, for the teachings of the Quran to supersede the teachings in the Bible, Jesus is brought down as another prophet. So a prophet can be superseded by a prophet, but Son of God cannot be superseded by a prophet. And this is an argument that Muslims will give you, that they respect Jesus, they think he's one of the greatest, he's got lots of fantastic things, and all that is fine, and they will focus on a lot of commonalities, one God and prophets and whatnot. But the idea of Jesus being Son of God is not in the Islamic codified Islamic. There'll be a few people who might, but they're not the mainstream authorities. In Islam as such, is not accepted. This means that now if you go to Christians and say, okay, they're willing to accept Jesus as a regular prophet, but not a Son of God. No virgin birth, no Son of God, this kind of thing. Is that acceptable? Christians will say, hell no, because you've tempered, you've mapped Christianity onto Islamic history centrism in order to kind of digest Jesus into Islam, but it's not acceptable. So it's one history centrism of Christianity and another history centrism of Islam, and the two cannot be reconciled in a win-win without one or the other having to be compromised a little bit. If this were not the case, then it would have been sorted out a long time ago. So another example is the Christian Zionists believe that the second coming of Christ, the end of time, all the stuff that's in the book of Revelation, is waiting for humans to restore the kingdom of Israel. And when the kingdom of Israel is restored, then all these things can happen. But the kingdom of Israel being restored involves restoring the temple of David, which is part of the kingdom of Israel. It's a very central part of the kingdom of Israel. And restoring this temple of David is not an easy thing, because today there's a mosque where the temple of David was. So, and this is not an ordinary mosque. This is the mosque from where Muhammad went to paradise. So you have a historical claim of one and a historical claim of the other, where the two are in conflict. And so one can just go on and on giving a whole lot of these examples of what happens when one comes from a history-centric tradition. The resulting exclusivity, the resulting absoluteness that emerges from the dharmic point of view, this seems to be an issue. So I bring out numerous of these kinds of differences in approach. And what I recommend is a Sanskrit is a technique in the Dharma traditions called Purva Paksha. Purva Paksha means reversing the gaze. I gaze at you and try to understand where you're coming from in a decent manner, not rhetorical, not taking pot shots, but trying to understand. Maybe my first cut won't be perfect, but I'll keep getting better and better. And my own journey in this book is a Purva Paksha of the West. So Purva Paksha means each side looks at the other and understands the other, and then tries to give a response using its own siddhanta, means its own worldview, its own theory. So the Purva Paksha tradition was very popular in the Indian classical period. Vedantins would do Purva Paksha with Buddhists, and then different schools of Vedanta would do Purva Paksha with each other and with Mimamsa. So there were all these different alternative worldviews doing Purva Paksha with each other. I consider that to be a better model for interfaith dialogue than the current model of sameness. So in the sameness model, interfaith dialogue means people are talking about how we all love each other, everything is same, there's no issues. And the alternative, which I call Purva Paksha, is that people are taking a serious look at difference from their own point of view in an atmosphere of mutual respect. So that's what the book is about. I welcome you to read it. Thank you for listening, and I would really look forward to France's comments and hope to learn from them. Thank you very much.
Time, I'd like to invite Professor Francis Clooney from Harvard University. He is a professor of divinity and comparative theology and director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. He is on numerous editorial boards and is the first president of the International Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. He was also the coordinator for the Interreligious Dialogue for the Society of Jesus. And most recently, he edited an important volume called The New Comparative Theology, Interreligious Insights from the Next Generation. So you can see that he'll definitely have some interesting rejoinders to make, perhaps, to Mr. Malhotra's commentary. So we welcome you, Professor Clooney. Thank you very much.
So I would like to begin by expressing my own appreciation to Balram Singh and the Indic Center for inviting me to be part of this event today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And to Rajiv for his own openness in the writing of the book. As he mentioned, he had shown me parts of his text in advance and was able to give some comments. And I appreciate the exchange that already is embodied in the book. So I think today's occasion is really an extension of a conversation that began before, and I think all of you will be part of it in a short time. I've always been interested in the India and the West conversation, the exchanges that go on, and as Rajiv said in his presentation, we're by no means at the beginning of that exchange or conversation. Just in the 20th century, I think back to Richard Garby's book, India and Christendom. It came out in 1914. Wilhelm Halbfass in the 1980s, published in German first and then in English, India and Europe. Raymond Schwab, around 1950, The Oriental Renaissance. And a host of scholars following in the footsteps of Edward Said's Orientalism, including my own teacher, Ronald Inden from the University of Chicago, exploring the way in which the West has imagined India and drawn India into the consciousness of the West and into the course of Western culture. And I think this exchange has been long overdue to have Indian scholars, Indian perspectives, opening up another way of looking at this relationship by seeing it from the Indian perspective, reimagining the West. Halbfass does a bit of this in his book, tries to look at the West in the Indian eyes, but I think there's much room for much more. My own work over the years in what you might loosely call Hindu-Christian studies has often been premised on the idea that any topic in Western or Christian philosophy or theology can be and needs to be critiqued and put in a different context by seeing what are analogous issues raised in Indian traditions, in Sanskrit, Tamil, and other languages, and to break out of the mold in which we're the only ones who get to set the terms, we're the only ones with a conceptual framework, but to see that the other culture, the other great systems of thought open up ways of looking at the same. And that's why in almost anything I write, I try to look to primary sources, because the exercise of having to learn from the other changes the way one even looks at one's own and punctures false universalism, where it becomes too easy and too general to talk about how we're all the same and so on. Once you begin to study the other, you see in 1,000 ways we are the same, and in 2,000 ways we're different. And I think we learn this. And I'm aware that, again, Rajiv is not claiming to be and is not the first to look at the West in light of India. I think of Swami Dayananda in the 19th century, Swami Vivekananda around 1900, opening up many perspectives and beginning to build bridges in which the Indian voice was much more prominently heard. Coomaraswamy up in Boston, Professor Coomaraswamy, and his very learned essays that draw together esoteric religion with ample doses of Christian mysticism, Thomas Aquinas, and so on. And recently, and I've used several of these authors in class, including Coomaraswamy and Vivekananda, but Sitaram Goel and Ram Swarup, writing in the late 20th century, often very harshly and very critically about the West, but finding that both for myself and for my students to hear these voices is actually important. And that precisely because somebody like Goel or Swarup would be looking at the West and Christianity in a very different way than I would look at it or I would express it, all the more reason to bring it into the conversation. And I think one of the things that has been needed are more sophisticated books that are more sensitive to the ambiguities, the dynamics of these exchanges, And I think Rajiv's book is a big step forward in terms of doing what they were trying to do often in their own way, but doing it better, doing it with a greater sensitivity to the complexities, and seeing how the exchange is not simply you attacked us, now we'll attack you, but rather a two-way street in which the conversation now can be carried on with greater sophistication. And I appreciate the fact that Rajiv has made it into a book. I have all my markers here. I was reading it very carefully. Because I think there are many things that can be said in venues like this, or in private conversations, or for the media, in which it's a very fluid conversation. It's hard to pin down what has been said and what does somebody mean. But the discipline and the risk of putting something in writing and publishing the book, where you can't easily take it back, it's there now, it's part of the record, actually is a step forward. And I know personally, again, from preaching or teaching, how you can say things and you can even revise as you're speaking. But when you decide to publish something, either in a magazine or a journal or a book in an academic setting, you have to be willing to say, for the moment, this is the best I can do, this is the best I can write. And I know Rajiv, as he's indicated, has thought about these issues for a long time and discussed them in many different venues. The service that he's done, I think, for both people in India, Hindus, and people in the West, including Christians, by putting it into writing, making it a book that can now be carried around, reviewed, discussed, and so on, is a great service. And I'm glad to be part of a conversation around the book. I note finally, as a final introductory comment, and I'll have comments specifically on things in the book, is that this book needs discussion from a variety of angles. And I do think that probably the most important conversation to take place is in the Hindu community. And Rajiv mentioned he just spent a lot of time in India doing precisely that, because I think there's a certain way in which people like me can respond to the book, but the internal dynamics of a conversation in India, people who are concerned about the perceptions of the West, wanting to articulate the other voice, is absolutely necessary, and that's probably the primary conversation. And so nothing I would say now would be primary. It would be important, I hope, but not the primary thing, because it's the other conversation that works best. Also, many of these issues are highly politicized. And we all know from reading newspapers, watching blogs, and so on, all the time now these things swarm around us in a highly charged political climate in which groups both in the West and in India, Christian and Hindu, are posturing for themselves by making certain claims about the other. And I think this book will invite that kind of politically charged conversation as well, and that's to be expected with a book that has this theme and this prominence. And I think, again, that's a different conversation. And I really don't want to get into the political ramifications of what does this book mean in a certain part of India, what does this book mean in areas where there's already a charged Hindu-Christian relation. I actually think the book should serve to defuse many of those concerns. But nonetheless, that's a different conversation than the one we might have here. And I think finally I would just say that my concern, therefore, is I'm Professor Clooney up here today. I mean, I could be many different kinds of persons up here, but raising a number of issues that I think have a certain interest in this room, I think, but also in the academic setting, and without reducing the book to those issues, nonetheless, to bring out some points that perhaps haven't been brought out in other contexts. And I'm sorry to say that for the most part I don't have anything terribly controversial to say. So there'll be no fist shaking at Rajiv or yelling or screaming or anything like that, because on many points I think we actually agree. Not that we're the same, but that we actually agree that these things need to be said. One of the services that I think recurs through the book, and particularly in its early parts, is clarifying both where does the modern Western consciousness and intellectual understanding and way of thinking and way of analyzing come from. And I'll come back to this point later, but reminding us and making clear that the modern West has a history, it has a biography, and that there is the Greek heritage, there is the biblical heritage, and there are all the ways in which these have been complexly interwoven over the centuries. And to remind us that the modern West is in itself, even by its own standards, not universal, not a timeless reality, but that what we think of as the rationality of modern secular culture or modern America or the modern world is already deeply embedded in a history that isn't complicated, and I think Rajiv nicely points this out. Also that in many ways over the generations that the West is already indebted to India. It's not simply saying, well, we've given you so many things for so many millennia, now we're willing to entertain a few gifts from you. But rather that this long history, and I won't go into details on this point, but that the West has already borrowed from India. The West has already learned from India. Even in ancient times, ideas coming from the subcontinent to the West have been embedded in and often concealed in the West's consciousness about itself. I mean, back to the days of Alexander the Great and Pythagoras and so on, the way in which ideas came west instead of simply going east. And the need to uncover and pay attention to the fact that you don't have two stable, separate, isolated realities, the West and India, the Christian world, the Hindu world, but these have already been an intertwined history for millennia. This can be worked out, I think, on a particularly small scale. At one point in the book, Rajiv discusses the Jesuit missionary, Robert de Nobili, one of the first Jesuits to seriously learn and study South Indian culture, South Indian Hinduism, apparently learning Sanskrit, although we have very little evidence left of that, but certainly learning Tamil and writing in the Tamil language. And as Rajiv shows in the book, going to great lengths to fit into the culture, dressing as a sadhu, calling himself a Brahmin or a Kshatriya, taking an Indian name, Tattva-Bodhikar, the teacher of the truth, and so on and so on. And even in a fascinating footnote that you have in the back, I think from Arun Shuri, about the Jesuits saying, oh, if only we could dye our skin so that we would look, we'd have a darker skin and we'd fit right into the culture. The many times I've been in South India, I know that on that level at least I have never fit into the culture. No one would mistake me for a South Indian. But I think de Nobili trying to say just to become entirely part of the culture. And this is a charged issue because on one level, in my tradition, Jesuit tradition, this is a noble effort to become part of, to communicate, to fit into the culture. But it also can be seen as the wolf in sheep's clothing, a kind of deception, using words like Veda for Bible, Guru for Jesus, and so on, Dharma for the religion. And this, I think it's important to hear both sets of sensitivities. So if we keep having a Western, Christian, Catholic, Jesuit understanding of people like de Nobili, that can become self-serving because you have to see from an Indian perspective, a Hindu perspective, what it's like to think that somebody came and fit into the culture and then smoothly fit into the culture and then tried to make the gospel as palatable as possible. There are all kinds of issues around that that need to be opened up. One of the further areas for research, I'd say, just as a footnote to that, is that many of the people in India, and not yourself, but who talk about de Nobili, rarely read de Nobili. And that his treatises in the Latin language, that was the common language of the church in the 17th century, are pleading for enculturation, pleading for adjustment to the situation in India, just as in the Greek and Roman world of the ancient Mediterranean. But when he writes in Tamil, and he has about 10 volumes that are preserved in the Tamil language, he becomes a fairly straightforward polemicist. One would think that in Tamil, in the language of the people, he would be even smoother and subtler and saying only nice things and then pulling people in. But he writes a book against Punarjanma Akshepa, against reincarnation. He writes a book showing that the Thomistic understanding of the self or the Atman is better than traditional Indian views. He argues the difference between incarnation and avatar, the way in which the Christian veneration of the saints and of images of the saints in church is not at all like the idolatry of the Hindus and so on. That often the stereotype is smoothly fitting in, trying to look Indian, means that you'll never raise a controversial point because you're trying to pretend everything is the same. When you actually read what de Nobili wrote in the Tamil language, you realize, oh no, he's actually right in your face about the differences. Now he often thinks, yes, these things are different and I'm right and you're wrong. But nonetheless, he's not concealing, he's rather accentuating the differences. So I think Rajiv opens up another perspective on material of historical importance, and that I think is a long history to follow or a long future in looking at those things. The general idea of the book in privileging difference or being different, again, I think is a good corrective, as Rajiv made just now in his opening comments. The way in which it can become kind of a lazy identity, an easy, can't we just all get along kind of mentality that doesn't really do us any good in the long run, becomes boring, becomes sterile, and people don't want to do it anymore. Now, on one level, you can say, well, it's actually better that we stress what's in common than killing each other. That's good. But nonetheless, intellectually, smoothing things over and neglecting differences actually is not a useful thing. And then also more on a more cogent intellectual point that Rajiv has made, that there's a certain kind of modern Western universalism that's a kind of amnesia. It's a forgetting again that there's a particular history to the modern West, a history to our ideas, a history to American culture, British culture, German culture, and so on. And then suddenly to discover, and this is the way all people everywhere think, these are the categories that are primary to human consciousness, is extremely misleading. Sure, there are ways in which historically, media-wise, ideas from America and Europe, go everywhere in the world, but to simply claim in a more essentialist fashion that the ideas of the modern West are everybody's ideas, and that everybody can be translated into the categories that we have. So a simple notion of God, a simple notion of religion, a simple notion of truth, a simple notion of reason, a simple notion of logic, a simple notion of history, etc. All of that, I think, Rajiv begins to take apart for us. And that's a very useful point again, is that anybody who claims a kind of universalism that, of course, everyone accepts without doubt is covering over most of the problematic and interesting things that can be said. And I think to see that and to say, sure, there's much that any culture can offer to the world, and there are ideas from the West that should travel everywhere, but to claim that they do so because they're essentially everyone's ideas already is just a historical mistake, and it's often accompanied by a kind of arrogance that needs to be punctured, and I think the book helps us to do that as well. I would distinguish, and I think this is a refrain through the book, how does Greek thinking and biblical thinking kind of come together? And I think one of the interesting things, but it can be a great problem about Christianity in the European context and then the colonial context, is two kinds of universalisms going together. One can be kind of, again, this essentialist, rationalist claim that we all think alike, namely everyone thinks the way we do. The universalism of going and preaching the gospel to all nations converges with that. They hold hands and they go together. But it's a different thing. Going back deep into the history of Israel, as one would have to do, into the prophets, into the sense of the covenants with Noah, the covenants with Abraham, the prophecies of Isaiah, and so on. There's a different sense of the one God of all the nations, which I think it would be wrong to confuse with Western rationalism, universalism. And so once we see the problem, to sort it out and say, well, over here there's a certain kind of secular rationalist problem, over here there's a question of the biblical heritage, but not to say that they're always the same. And I think that is, again, a follow-up question from the book. Also, and this again, I don't really want to get in, I'm not competent to get into the politics of this, but it seems that the book in some ways is catching up intellectually with where the world is going today anyway. That we all know, I mean, we read the newspaper every day, look at blogs, look at the media, that the supremacy of the West is in question, and that the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil, the rise of South Africa, I mean, these great nations that are even economically and then politically holding much greater sway, means that the power balances of the world are changing. And you could argue that a book like Being Different is in a sense part of that great shift that is taking place. You no longer have simply the West, as it has been for most of the past 500 years, but not before that, has been dominant, and therefore Ken could have said that our ideas are everyone's ideas, as countries like India, Brazil, China, and so on are clearly playing this much more dominant role, even among the bankers and among where the money goes. Obviously, the ideas are going to change, and you might say, well, it shouldn't be the case that my ideas are more important if there's money behind them. Nonetheless, people pay more attention. If you say, well, look how India is doing, the ideas need to be taken seriously. Look at South Africa, the ideas need to be taken seriously, and so on. And I think that's all going on, and the book is sort of going where we are in the early 21st century, and that's an important point. Rajiv mentioned the issue of translation. And there's one whole chapter that really deals with mistaken translation, mistaken equations, and I'll just read through some of the list here. Things that are really not the same. Brahman and Ishwara and God. Shiva is not the same as destroyer. Atman is not the same as soul or spirit. The Veda is not the same as the Bible. Dharma is not the same as religion. Jati and Varna are too simplistically translated as caste. Om is not the same as Amen. Dukkha and suffering may be different things. Avatar and incarnation are different. Shakti and spirit. Rishi and guru on the one side, saint on the other side. Karma, yoga, and Christian good works are not the same thing. Notions of suffering are not the same. Salvation and moksha, or liberation, are not the same. And I think in that very pointed chapter, Rajiv goes through all of these fairly briefly, but said maybe there'll be a book to come out of that as well. It's important to know that any of these translations we make have to be tentative acts, efforts to say something in a way that can communicate. But any kind of mindless, timeless equation to say, well, Ishwara and God mean the same thing, or yoga and spiritual exercises are the same thing, or Dharma and religion are the same thing, all of that is not only mistaken historically, but it's also just bad theory of translation. And I think what Rajiv is doing is raising a question that all of the terms we use, and all the ways those of us who teach the religions of India in an American classroom, all of it has to have a sense of tentativeness, where the translations we make can only be approximate. They need to be questioned because the words in English have a life of their own that is different from the life of the words in Sanskrit. And that over time, as Rajiv suggests, maybe it certainly has happened with words like yoga, karma, perhaps. These words become part of English to build a reservoir of other such terms that it's best that we not translate them, it's best that we leave them in the original language. Christian missionaries did this in Asia. I remember the case, I think it was in Matteo Ricci in China. The Jesuits in the very late 16th century, early 17th century, finally deciding that there was no word for Holy Spirit in Chinese, and they start using the Latin term for the Pavitra Spiritus, I think, something like that, because they said, well, anything we put the word into in Chinese is misleading, so why don't we just transliterate the Latin word and leave it at that? And if that can work in that direction, why not have it to work the other direction as well? I would think, though, and perhaps this point could be stressed more than I saw in the chapter, this is the beginning of an exchange, not the end of one. That once one realizes that Shakti is not spirit, liberation is not, moksha is not salvation, a God is not Ishwara, yoga is not spiritual exercise, that's a corrective and a kind of dampening of over-enthusiasm, but also opens the door to much more subtle exchanges. How does your understanding of Shakti change the way I think of spirit? How does your understanding of God with a capital G change the way I think of Ishwara? How do avatar and incarnation correct one another over the centuries? Even apart from the doctrine, many times, one time, if you begin to understand what happens when God comes into the world or takes on a human body, to see that there are different ways of explaining that, very sophisticated, both India and the West, and that the more I read, for instance, about, let's say, Sri Vaishnava South Indian understandings of avatar, that changes inevitably the way I think about incarnation, but it never leads to an equation. I mean, Rajiv is totally right that you would never want to, once you know something about these terms, you'd never want to identify them with one another. So the caution about translating and the caution about equivalences, I think, is not, the point is not to say, east is east and west is west and never shall the twain meet, but rather to say once we have the integrity of the being different, instead of kind of a homogenizing sameness everywhere, then that opens up the possibility of a more mature exchange, analogies of various sorts, in which one can learn from the other. Another issue that Rajiv makes in the book, I think very well, is this analysis of what kind of knowledge is operative in the modern West and what kind of learning counts. And I think this chapter is somewhat, this section is somewhat complicated, and I won't try to go through it, or this theme, I should say, but that it's not the case that Indian ways of thinking are necessarily to be identified with Western ways of thinking. and that there's a way in which, as Rajiv said, I mean, the Western understanding of history is so important and so central, and so many points in Christian doctrine, Christian teaching, go back to the historicity of Jesus. I think in some ways that is a problem for the modern West as well as for traditional India. Why does the Christian tradition in the creed and so on have such kind of historical particularity? That's what it is, but nonetheless it changes the way even modern Western Christians think about the truth of their religion. And there's a way in which, as you rightly point out, Rajiv, in your book, that the interiority, the timelessness, the apprehension of truths that are not historically delimited is much more possible to speak about in the Hindu traditions. And yet there's a way in which the very specific density of historical claims in Christian tradition leads to a different kind of universalism. And I think it's a difficult exchange, and I don't want to say any more about it now, but that the way in which history matters is an excellent point to put on the table. And then to say it's not that those who privilege history less are wiser than those who think history is important, but rather to talk about what do we do, as you mentioned with your Anglican counterpart in the conversations in India, what do you do when we realize point after point we just instinctively think different things are important? One of the things that I thought more could be said on in the book is the knowledge of the Rishi tradition, the Rishis, including Patanjali and the Yoga Sutras and so on. What exactly, how do we know that tradition? How do we know what the Rishis thought? How do we know how they came to know what they know? And then what kind of transmission of that knowledge, what kind of discipline is there to it? So that the Rishis are these intuitive seers, speakers of the realities, and yet that often is put in this Sanskriti framework where it has a very narrowly defined specificity to it after some time. But again, from a Western perspective, the historical question, how do you know what the Rishis said? How do we have any idea what Patanjali's own experience might have been, whether he was even a Rishi at all? But I think opening that door is important. On the Indian ways of thinking, non-linear thinking, which I think is an important issue to raise, as opposed to some models in the modern West, going back to Aristotle in a certain way of linear thinking, the exclusion of the middle ground and so forth like that. I think Indian openness to a certain subtlety regarding multiple possibilities and non-contradiction of a different sort is really key. I've been teaching a seminar this semester on Purva Mimamsa, one of the great darshanas of India, and it's clear again and again that these are reasonable people. These are logically firm, cogent thinkers in Jaimini, Shabara, Kumarala, and so on in the tradition, but the way they're fashioning what counts as an argument, the way they're using Purvapaksha Siddhanta, the way they're thinking about ritual time and space, the way they're thinking about priorities of one rule over another and so on, there's nothing comparable in the West. And I think to be able to get at that and to realize that different ways of thinking are interesting for different reasons and that none of them is simply a poor example of the other, I think opens a great door, and I'm glad you raised those points. All through the book, and I shouldn't say all through the book, but a number of points in the book, kind of in a way I think that'll make the book easy to teach or useful in teaching, kind of metaphors of difference, chaos and order, the desert and the forest, the joker and the clown, for instance, those vivid examples that come to the fore, that I think are ways of catching differences between India and the West. Any metaphor, any example, chaos and order, joker and clown and so on, if you push them too far, they go poof, and they don't work anymore. But nonetheless, ways of opening up the conversation, I think, is incredibly important. A certain obsession in the modern West with order, rationality, keeping things neat, a fear of chaos. Chaos is bad. Whereas you point out, including on the cover of your book, the way in which there's a sense that the disorder or the dynamic evolution of things where nothing is ever finished or set is instinctively more comfortable in the Indic context than in the West. That's important to point out. I don't think it comes down to the Christian understanding of order versus chaos to a kind of rigid duality. The Christian doctrine of creation, the Christian use of older Near Eastern mythology about the creation of the world, And then the incredibly complicated, chaotic history of the people of Israel seems to be saying, well, this chaotic world in which we live, where human desires are unwieldy, and we never know what people are up to, and God is unpredictable, seems to be saying, if you can't find God in the chaos of the people of Israel, you won't find God. And so, even though you're right, I think that there's a sense of excluding messy alternatives, excluding other voices as Western history moves on. And this could be the Aristotelian heritage. Some of the very biblical material that posits this very strong sense, I am your God, there is no other, also says, I am your God, there is no other, and you endlessly frustrate me, you people. And endlessly I will try again, because the chaos of human existence is never done away with by the greatness of God. And so it's a different understanding that we might talk more about. The desert and forest, just for time's sake, I'll pass over that one, but it's very interesting. What happens in the desert? How does one learn in the desert as opposed to the forest or the jungle? I don't think the desert is simply empty or not, but there's a way in which when you are in the desert, there is only the Word of God, and there's no other, it's like a starkly bare reality that could be done with. The Joker and the clown, two things I'd say. The Joker, your example for the Joker was the Joker from Batman. Particularly the latest, it was at the beginning, the one about the beginning of Batman, the Heath Ledger, who died after making the movie, but this totally frightening, chaotic figure. And I would say it's a kind of nihilism. The way in which the Joker, with a capital J, but maybe with a small j, is into a nihilism where if there is chaos, then nothing counts anymore. Everything is immoral, amoral, a total kind of casting aside of values, because the mad individual is the one who rules society. And Batman struggling with that, but in some ways buying into it, and the DA buying into it, and so on like that. Whereas the clown, as you say, in different Indian dramas and so on, ends up reinforcing the order of things. I suspect, just to add one point to that, that the Western history of the clown, not so much the Joker, but the clown, the jester, the fool in Shakespeare's plays and so on, there's a way in which there's a sense that the figure who mocks the king, the clown who plays around instead of being serious, the insistence of medieval monarchs that there be a jester in the court, has something to pick up on. And this would be a very interesting level of East-West exchange, India and the West, instead of just on these very serious, large terms, but to, what is the role of the eccentric, the outsider, the Joker, the clown? Needn't come down to the nihilism of the Joker in Batman versus the Vidushika in the Indian plays. But I think you're onto something very important in that way. A couple of points. One more major point, and then I'll just wrap up very briefly because we want to talk about these things. The one area that the book that I had a certain dis-ease about was chapter 3, the integral unity and synthetic unity. And again, I don't mean to say it shouldn't have been done the way it was done. I think it raises excellent questions and is important. But in terms of raising difficult questions, this integral unity, and Rajiv made this point in his presentation, so I won't have to repeat that, but the synthetic unity, trying to put disparate things together that Rajiv perceives as the history of the West. At one point he describes this synthetic unity of the West that's, in quotes, starts with parts that exist separately from one another. So you have many disparate things that then have to be synthesized and brought together. I don't think that actually is the Christian, at least, understanding of the synthesis. That the very idea that God created the world out of the chaos, in some sense, means that all through its history, from the moment of creation for all eternity thereafter, God is forever creating the world, and that everything that exists is in some way dependent on the creative will of God. And that it's not so much like a bunch of things in the world that somebody's trying to put together and synthesize. It's not, you're right, totally right, it's not the yogic integral synthesis to which you point, but there's a way in which the intentionality of God, let there be light, let the world be in order, is a different kind of synthesizing, but it's an incredibly potent spiritual synthesis that perhaps deserves a little more patience than you gave it. The 4 inherent problems in the West, on page 145, Rajiv lists 4 of them: deficiency of the inner sciences, anti-intellectualism and the absence of debate, reason, and cosmological exploration within the core Christian scriptures, external projection, the wrong quest for freedom by the Western ego, are all points we need to take seriously. And some of your predecessors, such as Ram Swarup, have raised questions about the sharp contrast between the yogic integral understanding of self, and you don't, when you read the Bible, you don't pick up on that. You don't see yogic exercise or integral learning of that sort. But it seems that on all of these points, I think you make a good point, but perhaps I wasn't entirely persuaded that there aren't other elements and resources in the Western and Christian tradition and in the Bible itself about the discipline, the integration of learning that enables us to see how things fit together. There's a way in which, and you weren't doing this, but it allies itself, somebody could ally it with a certain kind of sense that the Old Testament was just ritual, the Old Testament was just external, the Old Testament was just the law, and that, as I understand from my limited study of the prophets and so on, there was actually a great effort to rethink law in terms of community, rethink law in terms of the sovereignty of the will of God, and the ritualism is always a danger to be overcome. But then the rabbinic tradition, which is not Christian, and yet draws on the law and the prophets, I think had incredibly creative ways of thinking alternatives to modern secularity and rationalism, and alternative to the Christian synthesis that shouldn't be left out of the picture. And I leave it out usually, but I think in terms of what happened to the biblical heritage, to listen to the rabbis more about their understanding. And as you know, at the AAR over the years, Judaism and Hinduism have often been in dialogue, and that's a great thing. But a little bit more sympathy at that point, I think. The incompatibility of Christian dogma and Greek reason. And I think that can be misleading in a way. I mean, there's a point in which the creed and so on have all kinds of paradoxical claims that are hard to explain. And if you ask any average churchgoer coming out of church on Sunday, they're very hard to explain. And the idea that Christ is truly God, truly human, the one eternal Son of the Father, and so on, this can be seen as a great burden. But the Greek reason is already in there when the Christian dogmas become dogmas. So the primal stories of Jesus in the Gospels, for instance, are not the dogmas. The dogmas come hundreds of years later when the early Christian intellectuals are drawing on the Greeks and putting these things together. So I wouldn't quite put it in the same way, Christian dogma and Greek reason as incompatible, but that perhaps Greek reason drew out of the Christian sources certain kinds of dogmas that constantly are slightly incoherent, that there's a level at which inside the Christian synthesis there are elements of dis-ease because these pieces don't fit together. But Greek reason was part of it from extremely early on, before we actually had anything that we consider in the Creed. A footnote here, Rajiv made me go back and read Matthew Arnold, his book Culture and Anarchy from 1869. Matthew Arnold, the poet, literary critic, has this wonderful little book, which I have not read carefully, but I did go back to it, on thinking about the heritage, the dual heritage of the Greeks in the Bible, or as he puts it in the key chapter for this purpose, Hebraism and Hellenism. And the way in which he's very nice about it, but arguing that even though we see ourselves in biblical or Hebraic tradition, it's really not the same thing as the Hellenic or Greek tradition. And that these things are, we often talk about them, he says, as if the biblical worldview won out and the Greeks were subdued and brought in. But actually, when you look at it closely, there are all kinds of ways in which these things don't fit together, and there's a great tension there. And I think by the end of what Arnold is doing, at least in my quick review of it, he's arguing that, very much as your whole book does, that once we realize that the biblical heritage and the Greek heritage are not the same thing, they're different, there are different dynamics, it's tricky to keep them together, then the biblical heritage has a better future because it's not pretending to be Greek reason. And I think, in a way, using Arnold would be a whole fascinating thing to go read that chapter in particular on Hebraism and Hellenism again and have a discussion about his insights into how we think about the issues today. So I'm glad you pointed that out. But I think it doesn't go toward the absolute static incompatibility of the Greek and the biblical, but rather that the problem of keeping these together always has to be rethought in a new way. On page 154, I'm almost done, the 5 problematic synthetic movements, the emergence of Rome and the birth of Western Christendom, Renaissance and Reformation, Enlightenment and the birth of modern science, Oriental Renaissance, colonialist expansion, is again a very trenchant set of 5 problematic syntheses that we need to go back and look at, particularly in terms of the way they affected the rest of the world. But in some ways here, it can also be taken as another version of the modern West story about itself. So there's Rome, the birth of Christendom. Let's skip the Middle Ages and go to the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Reformation leads to the Enlightenment and modern science. That leads to the new reception of the East, and then colonialism. And I think in some ways it's always been a problem in the West. Let's skip the Middle Ages. Let's skip the Catholic heritage. Let's forget about the Greek Orthodox and Eastern rites altogether. And that the way in which, if we're going to talk about Christianity in this context, you're rightly picking out a number of allergic dualities and problems that need to be faced. But I think all of them need further study, and I think you'd agree with that. And then if it all sort of leads up to colonialist expansion as kind of this is where the West was heading, there are triumphalist Westerners who think that the whole point of the 19th century was finally to dominate the world and make everyone European or make everyone American. But I think there have always been the skeptics and the counter voices in the Western tradition, particularly in Christian traditions, who say that this idolization of the modern West is a great mistake and that we have to turn back from that. So I thought some of that could be nuanced, I'm sure will be in further discussion. Finally, where do we go from here? And I'll stop with this. Several points in the book, Rajiv puts forward a very prudent and I think one that we can all keep list of how we go about this. On page 50, what we need to do if we're going to have any decent conversations, a recognition and reduction of difference anxiety on both sides, a willingness to articulate and understand major differences, both in terms of philosophical, theological debates and actions, a negotiation of the thorny issues of history centrism, exclusivism, aggressive conversion in the West, a less passive attitude toward real-world issues and religious differences on the part of dharmic practitioners, so each side gets challenged here, and an understanding of the need to reform and correct the self-aggrandizing and self-referential institutional networks that produce cultural analysis, including academic institutions, foundations, the media, and publishers. And one of the things that Rajiv is famous for is giving everyone at the American Academy of Religion a hard time and scholars who study Hinduism a hard time. And I think this puts it very nicely in terms of it's not just nagging or picking away at people, but there's a larger, much more kind of, you might say, civilized program of conversation that needs to take place in which the necessity comes of raising uncomfortable questions for the other. This is repeated, and I won't read all of it, at the end of the book on page 339, where Rajiv adds to it the fact that the point of the conversation, once it's on a level playing field, is not that one side wins by converting the other, but on the second level, we're not out to intellectually convert everyone. On another level, there's no reason to think it's a win-win situation all the time. There may be situations in which one side has to concede, you're right, this doesn't actually work, this is not coherent. We've been mistaken in thinking about it this way. And how to keep the balance of kind of a civil, humane, decent respect for one another and avoid competition, and yet also be able to say this is not win-win. In certain cases I may lose, certain cases you may lose, in a sense by having to give ground, which ultimately would be to our gain. I think where this leaves us, 2 things, and then I'll stop. One would be the book raises fascinating questions about how this future conversation is to continue. The problem is, with whom does it continue? And it seems that, as you were saying, you already were discussing the book in India with swamis and business leaders and students and so on. Here we are today. I'm sure there'll be other venues in the West, or have been already. Different conversations have to proceed differently. And the kind of academic conversation among experts who are, scholars of Western history, scholars of Indian history and so on, is one conversation. The great kind of photo ops of leaders sitting down and talking to one another is a different kind of conversation. The popular conversation, let's say where a book like this would be used in the classroom in India, is a different conversation, and these have to be kept distinct. because what you might say about the book in a context like today or an academic setting is not really the way it would be received or talked about in a classroom in Delhi or a classroom in New Jersey. And neither of those is what the Pope and the Swami will say to one another when they meet. But I think part of the agility of this conversation has to be to say, we can't all engage in the same conversation in the same way at the same time. So we have to know who we're talking to and what kinds of issues are at stake. So you're not going to be rereading Matthew Arnold with everybody in the conversation. And with other groups, you may be saying, let's talk about the clown and the joker, or let's talk about the desert and the forest. And so different levels need to be sorted out. But I think the last main point, and you make this a number of times at the end, is if we're aware then that differences do matter, that being different is a virtue that we need to uncover and give more room for, this leaves us with an enormous amount of work to do. Because it's so easy to say, we're radically different, I'm not interested in you, I'd like you to go away, leave it at that. Or we're all the same, and there's really nothing here to think about, nothing to learn, because no matter what you say, it's the same as what I say. Once we push those lazy alternatives off stage, then there's an incredible amount of research to do, incredible amount of way, not only for Westerners to chasten and redo the way we talk about India and Hinduism, but for learned intellectual Hindus to start knowing the West with a great deal of sophistication and in much more subtlety than has often been the case in the past. But I'm grateful to you, Rajiv, for doing the book and for raising all these issues in a way that opens rather than closes down conversation. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Clooney. We're really glad to have you here and have that conversation. And in the interest of continuing this conversation sooner than we thought, I guess, I'd like to invite Mr. Malhotra back to just say a few words for perhaps about 10 minutes, and then I think we'll have questions and close after that with our book signing and reception.
Thank you, Francis. I thoroughly enjoyed your comments and agreed with them. In fact, you've given me things to think about, which is what the conversation and it's our manthan, our going back and forth in dialogue. So I'll just go very briefly through the notes I took, which I'll work on later for future writing purposes. I think it is true that many others have done something similar. You mentioned Swami Dayanand, Saraswati, Vivekanand, Kumar Swami. I think that needs to be updated. Some of those were very long ago, and I'm trying to update them, because postmodernism, which I critique in this book, is a new kind of a thing. Those guys weren't aware of it. Now, Said, yes, in Said's footsteps, a huge amount of Indian post-colonialists have emerged to do a very recent critique of the West, gazing at the West. But the difference I have, my approach from their approach, is that the post-colonialist scholars in India do not have a grounding in the Dharma traditions, in classical Indian thought. They do not identify with it. They aren't well-read or sympathetic towards the Sanskrit tradition and Indian classics. So their critique of the West is largely a secular, using Enlightenment models, using Marxist models. So the post-colonial Indian critique of the West is almost like a Western self-critique. They're kind of critiquing the Western thought using Western thought. And I'm doing a Purva Paksha from the Indian thought point of view. So that's a point of difference. I do agree that with you that Sitaram Goyal and Ram Swarup, while trying to do something similar, they were more into the politics of political resources, the capturing of political resources, contemporary politics. I want to be into the knowledge systems, the space called one knowledge system is discussing with the other knowledge system, rather than one political party discussing with another political party. And there's a clarity I achieved during this trip to India. In my talk in the University of Delhi, And they decided after that and after all the exchange to use this as a textbook for MA classes in psychology starting in 2012. One of the three respondents whom I really appreciated a lot is a Professor Thaper from Jawaharlal Nehru University, professor of political science. And he made an interesting point. He said that what you are talking about is when you're talking about Dharma and when you're talking about Indian civilization, you are talking about a comparative of knowledge systems. And you are not talking about modern politics as the identity. It's the identity of a knowledge system and not the identity of a modern political movement. And I thought that really helped me crystallize where I'm coming from and where I'm often misunderstood. Because often this kind of a discussion about a knowledge system gets appropriated into contemporary politics, which is a tendency that Francis mentioned and I'm very cognizant of. But that's life. I mean, I have to do what I do, realizing that there are people who make a political thing out of it. But my goal in India, I have three audiences I'm interested in. First, I'm interested in academics so that this very hugely taught Western universalism gets punctured, because you go to Indian philosophy departments, they're teaching Western philosophy more than anything else. You go to psychology department, it's Western psychological models. Religious studies does not even hardly exist in India. So I'm trying to introduce classical Indian models within India itself. The second is the corporate world, where I'm being invited because corporate people are now facing the situation where they're on the world stage and they have to suddenly explain who are we. When they meet a Japanese, he's clear on who he is. The Chinese, very clear, has a sense of history, a sense of Chinese approach to things. The French guy is very French. The Italian is very Italian. The American is very clearly American. And the Russian is not abashed about being very distinctly Russian. So the Indian is mixed up because of the colonial past, does not quite know how to explain who we are as a civilization. So that's a second audience. And the third audience is religious gurus. And with religious gurus, my question is, how much are you investing in comparative religion, comparative philosophy, comparative history? And the answer is, we're not. And that's where I'm trying to start. So during this trip, two very prominent gurus invited me to their campus and addressed their students and their advanced thinkers exactly to kind of ignite this sort of Purva Paksha. And when I'm told by some religious people, let's not talk about others with difference, I might remind them of the phrase of the word Purva Paksha, that this is a very much Indian way. It's just that we forgot to do Purva Paksha in recent centuries. We used to do it when the argument was with the Buddhist as the other or some other lineage. But when the Westerners came, we did not do Purva Paksha on them. And we're paying the price because they've mapped us onto their framework and we do not have a proper response because we never did Purva Paksha. And I think it's laziness. It's also kind of an inferiority complex to colonialism, which has to be reversed using this kind of book that I have come up with. Now, I particularly appreciated Francis' comment on two different ways of looking at enculturation. Enculturation seen from the Jesuit side as a way of accommodating local culture and so on, and seen from the Indian side as, kind of sneaking in the door, not fully. Some of this translation of Sanskrit terms, appropriating the Sanskrit terms with an ideology of a history-centric ideology, which kind of defeats the purpose of that Sanskrit term. So that's the way I've come at it. And I think we need more conversations to understand enculturation more fully and all its consequences, not only in the theoretical realm but also in the backwaters where enculturation can lead to a confused person not knowing quite where his bearings are and being used in that sense. The Hebraic versus Hellenistic, or the Judeo-Christian versus Greek reasoning, is a point I go into quite a lot, that this is what the synthetic unity is, because the issues I feel are not quite resolved. even today, the debate on creationism versus evolution is a kind of modern version of this, scientific reasoning side and the revelation side. And the debates on the presidential elections and the issues that they're talking about are a kind of a schism within the West. So this is something that I want to continue working on in order to understand what would be the effect of further assimilation of dharmic ideas into West. What would it do to the West itself? How would the West modified, because Francis mentioned that this exchange has been going on for a long time, and a whole lot of these ideas already are into Christianity. What happens, at what point can it not go further? I mean, is there such a point where the core DNA of historicity, the nature of the self, linear time, the core DNA of Judeo-Christianity would not be able to take further assimilations? Where is that point? And that is what I'm trying to find. How far can we go? Or can we just keep going, such that in names they might be Christian, but actually their worldviews become very Hindu? I mean, where is the boundary? And that is really what I'm after in this whole exercise. Regarding Francis' question on the Rishi tradition, that maybe we need to learn more about what they know, what is their methodology, how do we even know that they actually had those experiences, and maybe and they were not sort of fiction or fantasy or hallucinations. I rely on modern rishis, and I consider Ramana Maharshi, I consider Sri Aurobindo as contemporary rishis who've had experiences and explained them in enormous detail. And I'm extremely fond of reading Sri Aurobindo in particular, because as a modern rishi, he brings this whole rishi tradition to the current wavelength where people can relate to it, and especially since he writes mainly in English. So I offer that as a resource. Now, I am also in agreement that there are elements within Christianity itself that would be like an integral unity. That the integral unity versus synthetic unity is not an absolute thing. But then the West as such, and in even Christianity as such, haven't fully absorbed, digested, accepted these models. Some of them are on the fringes. Another book I'm doing is on Hindu-Buddhist influences on modern Christian thinkers. From De Nobili, Teilhard de Chardin, many modern people, to Francis Clooney. What are some of the, because all of them, it's very interesting, Protestants have not done this as much as Catholics. I mean, if you look at De Nobili, you look at Teilhard de Chardin, Father Ryan, you look at a whole lot of, they tend to be Anglican or Jesuits, and I have listed about 10 major thinkers who have engaged Hinduism and or Buddhism for decades of their lives. Panikkar, a great example. And then how they have experienced Christianity or reimagined Christianity as a result of that. So that's a book I'm doing to show that this is a conversation that has been going on. And the question I haven't answered is how far would they be willing to go in terms of this assimilation of Hindu ideas before they would say, well, I cannot cross this line. Panikkar goes pretty far, I think. So there's something to talk about. The other point I agree with Francis is that regardless of all this view of the West, there have always been counter voices and skeptics within the West itself. And that is true. There have been voices within the West that are contradicting and refuting the very things I characterize in the West. And perhaps my book is addressing these people. My book is finding people within the West who actually are more on this wavelength. So when we say Indian thought, it is not Indian by birth that makes it Indian thought. It happened to have originated there. But a Westerner who can do yoga and who can do various kinds of things, Indian practices, can also be someone who adopts the Indian worldview. And similarly, what is called the Western worldview is not necessarily limited to people by birth who are Westerners. In fact, I would surmise that there's a large number of Indians who are Westerners. And I also have a book on what I call white Indians. which is a future book, which is the whole obsession to be sort of white, in Delhi, places like that, very fashionable to become westernized and so on. So I think the blurring of boundaries is there, and it's an interesting exercise to see how far this can go. So where are the conversations, and then I'll stop. My conversations are in the academy. That's what I like to do. In the people in corporate life who are interested in presenting themselves on the world stage. That's a very new audience that did not exist. And in the guru tradition and religious traditions, both Christian seminaries and Hindu and Buddhist type of organizations, trying to deepen their knowledge of the other, encourage Purva Paksha, and create maybe a next wave or next generation higher level of interfaith dialogue. So that's where I'm coming from. Thank you, Francis, for exceedingly wonderful comments, and we'll continue this conversation in the days to come. Thank you.
Ask this question because this is from students who have been watching your presentations. One student, Sharada to Rajiv, says, how simple question is, high school students, how long does it take to write this book?
Well, I'm writing in parallel many books, and this is volume 1 of 7 volumes that I'm trying to finish up, 1 or 2 volumes a year. And these 7 volumes I've been working on for about 15, 20 years, all simultaneously juggling around whether a particular chapter. Even in the last moments, I removed some chapters to put them in future chapters. So this is a parallel work going on. And this is my own Samudra Manthan, if you will, an internal churning that goes on. So that's my story.
There is another question for you, Rajiv, from Nina Cabral. Says, why do you think the majority of the people are not different? Do not try to stand out. Why do they go with the flow?
Well, I think it is important to go with the flow at certain level. I mean, I'm not suggesting that being different means that you are cut off, you're isolated, you are in a silo or a cocoon somewhere. I think people should engage, people should be part of the globalization, should be part of multiculturalism. All that is very important, but simultaneously without losing the distinctiveness of who one is. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive, going with the flow and retaining one's sense of distinctiveness. I think both can be done.
Okay, thank you. Nina Cabral, Francis, has a question for you. She says, do you think that most religions are similar to Christianity but worship differently? Are all ideas of God created similar?
No, I think we agree that there are both similarities and differences involved, that in a Christian perspective, God seemed to want to make the human race incredibly varied, incredibly diverse, so that while it's possible to say Americans and Chinese and Indians and Brazilians and everybody else, we're human beings, and that implies an enormous amount of common nature and so on, and yet we're different. Our languages are different, our cultures, the way we practice the meaning of life, all of these things differ. So I think differences and similarities always have to both be on the table, and that in certain contexts, such as human rights, we might want to say nobody has a right to kill or torture somebody because this is a human being we're talking about. Likewise, in certain areas, don't assume that everything I say is just what you already know. So some tension of similarity difference, both are going to be relevant.
Thank you. The last question from this American Vivekananda Academy for New Hampshire students. Sabika to Rajiv Malhotra present that Dharma cannot be replaced as religion. If so, is there any other name that can be replaced as Dharma?
Well, I think Dharma should be just the name for Dharma. Why do you need to legitimize Dharma by looking for an English word? Why is there the anxiety that says, what's the other word that is going in English that is going to replace Dharma? Why not introduce Dharma and make it an English word? It already is in a kind of pop culture sense. but make it more clear. And when you go to conferences, or when you talk about, when people say, "What's your religion?" say, "I'll tell you my dharma."